It is July 1934. Marie Curie is dying in a sanatorium in the French Alps. The director of the facility has written down what he sees. Her bone marrow has stopped producing blood. The disease is aplastic anemia, caused by decades of handling radium and polonium without protection. She is 66 years old, and the substances she spent her life studying have spent her life studying her back, entering through her pockets, through her breath, through the faint blue glow she once called beautiful and carried home in her coat. She has 2 daughters. Iron, 36. Eve, 29. They are not at her bedside when she says the thing she says in her final days. I regret having given my life so entirely to my work, instead of devoting myself to my family. She was the most famous scientist on Earth. She had twice been awarded the Nobel Prize, in physics, in chemistry, the first and only person to win it in 2 separate sciences. Her discoveries changed medicine. Her name would outlast empires. And in her last days in a mountain sanatorium, the thing she said was, "I gave the wrong thing my life." Her daughters heard this eventually. They had been hearing something like it for years. This is the story of what Marie Curie gave to Iron and Eve. Not the discoveries, not the prizes, what she gave them without meaning to, and where the damage finally rested. There is a photograph taken in Warsaw in 1891. Marie Skłodowska is 23. Her hair is pulled back. She is standing straight in the careful way of someone who has taught herself not to take up too much room. She is not smiling, but there is something in her expression that looks like the held-back force of a person who believes the world is about to make good on a very long promise. She had paid for that belief. Her mother died of tuberculosis when Marie was 10. A long death, kept at careful distance. In those years, loving someone with tuberculosis meant loving them from across the room. Her oldest sister died of typhus the same year. Her father, a brilliant mathematics teacher under Russian occupation in Warsaw, watched his career be dismantled by a government that forbade Polish culture in Polish schools. Marie grew up watching a gifted man be reduced, slowly, by the smallness of people in power. She filed it away. She did not become small. She made a pact with her sister Branya. She would work as a governess, earning money she did not keep, to fund Branya's medical education in Paris. Then Branya would support her while she followed. It was the arrangement of 2 women who understood that the system would not simply let them through and had decided to take turns carrying each other over. They kept the pact. Both of them. The kind of loyalty that comes from knowing neither of you will survive without the other. When Marie finally arrived in Paris in 1891, she lived in a 6th-floor room with no heat, surviving on bread and chocolate and tea, studying 16 hours a day. She graduated first in her physics degree, second in mathematics. She did not do this despite the hardship. The hardship was the condition inside which everything grew, the early losses, the deferred years, the discipline of someone who has been told repeatedly that the ground beneath her is not stable and has decided to be the stability herself. In 1894, a mutual colleague introduced her to a French physicist named Pierre Curie. He was 35. He had vowed never to marry, on the grounds that love would be a distraction from science. He changed his vow within a year of meeting Marie. He proposed twice before she accepted. She was still uncertain about remaining in France, still carrying a sense of obligation toward Poland that never fully left her. Pierre told her he would follow her to Warsaw if she could not stay. She stayed. What they built was something the scientific world had rarely seen, a true partnership. They worked together in a leaking shed near the École de Physique at de Chimay, processing tons of pitchblende ore by hand, breathing the dust, stirring boiling masses with iron rods for hours at a stretch. Marie's hands were so damaged by the chemical work that she sometimes could not button her coat. They did not stop. They were discovering something, they didn't yet know what, inside the ore. Something that was not uranium, but was far more radioactive than uranium. Something no one had named. They named it polonium, after Marie's lost country. Then they found radium. When the French Academy of Sciences nominated Pierre alone for the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1903, he refused to accept unless Marie was included. She became the first woman in history to win a Nobel Prize. She was also, by then, a mother. Iron had been born in 1897, and Pierre's father, the retired physician Eugene Curie, had moved in to help raise her. Because the laboratory was consuming both parents and someone steady had to be there. Eve arrived in 1904. The household had found its rhythm by then. Science, the grandfather, occasional summers in Brittany, letters from Marie when she traveled. The children were loved. They were also, mostly, in the care of someone other than their mother. Marie knew this. She recorded it. In her private diary, she described the guilt that arrived at night, her longing to be two people at once, the particular ache of a woman who loves her children and cannot make herself stay home. She was not a cold person. She was a person whose interior life ran at such heat that everything near her had to learn to orbit from a safe distance. In the spring of 1906, there is a photograph of the family in the garden of their house in Sceaux. Pierre is laughing at something outside the frame. Iron, 8 years old, leans against his arm. Eve, 18 months, sits in Marie's lap. Marie looks directly at the camera. There is no sign of what is 6 weeks away. April 19, 1906. Paris. Rain. Pierre Curie was crossing the Rue Dauphine when he stepped out from behind a horse-drawn cab into the path of a second, heavily loaded wagon. He slipped on the wet cobblestones. The back wheel passed over his skull. He was 46 years old. He died without regaining consciousness. Marie was told at the laboratory. She went to the room where his body was. She stayed for a long time. That night, she began writing in her diary, not to herself but to Pierre, directly, as though death had made him temporarily unavailable rather than permanently gone. She would write to him this way for years. "Pierre, my Pierre," she wrote, "you are there, calm as a poor wounded man resting in sleep, with your head bandaged. Your face is sweet and serene, it is still you, lost in a dream from which you cannot escape. We put you in the coffin Saturday morning, and I held your head for the last time. We kissed your cold face for the last time." She did not stop working. Within weeks of Pierre's death, she accepted his professorship at the Sorbonne, becoming the first female professor in the institution's history. When she gave her inaugural lecture that November, the auditorium was full. They had come expecting a widow's grief. She began on the exact sentence where Pierre's last lecture had ended, a precise, technical summary of recent developments in physics, and she did not stop until the hour was done. She did not acknowledge the crowd. She did not weep. She had a name for this. She called it duty. Her daughters were 8 years old and 18 months old. What entered Marie Curie's life on April 19, 1906, was not simply the death of a husband. What entered was the collapse of the one human relationship that had made her fully present in the world outside science. Pierre had been the person who brought her back from the work, who walked with her in the evenings, who read poetry at dinner, who cycled beside her through the countryside on weekends, who was evidence that she could be loved without becoming less. Without him, there was only the work. And she went to it with the intensity of a person who has lost the one thing that was making her take breaks. Her daughters were 8 years old and 18 months old, and the woman who returned from Pierre's death was not the woman who had been their mother before it. Those who knew Marie before and after Pierre's death did not describe the change in terms of grief. Grief implies a passage, a duration with an end. What they described was a narrowing, a permanent reduction in aperture, as if the field of what she could attend to had contracted irrevocably to a single point. She grieved privately. The diary she kept writing to Pierre, as though correspondence with the dead were a slower form of correspondence, was where the devastation lived. She wrote about sitting at his desk, about the smell of the house without him, about how she had held his head in her hands before the coffin closed and known, even then, that the face was not him, and that him had gone somewhere she could not follow. Then she closed the diary and went back to the laboratory. This is not contradiction. This is the logic of a particular kind of survival. The work was not a distraction from grief. The work was the only place where Pierre still existed, where the problems they had shared remained open, where his methods lived in the apparatus on the bench, where she was not a widow but simply a physicist, still answering the questions they had started together. She could not have him. She could continue him. She moved the family to a house in Sceaux, near his grave. She brought Pierre's father. She arranged an extraordinary cooperative school with several other Paris scientists, Jean Perrin, Paul Langevin, and others, taking turns teaching each other's children in their own homes. Iron learned physics from the people who were rewriting it. The children had tutors, music lessons, summers in the countryside, Polish language lessons, bicycle rides, all of it organized with care. By any standard the era recognized, this was not negligence. But what was absent was a thing that cannot be scheduled. The unremarkable availability of a mother who is simply present, who can be interrupted without the interruption costing something. Who notices the silence at dinner without it being announced. Who is there not because the calendar permits it but because she is there. Marie could not be interrupted. Because she was, in some meaningful sense, always somewhere else. The laboratory was the one place she was least alone. The one place grief had not fully claimed. She wrote warm letters when she traveled, specific, loving, asking about the cat and the garden and who had learned what, and the letters are evidence of love. They are also evidence that love was, very often, the thing she managed from a distance. Pierre's father died in 1910. After that, it was governesses. A series of them. Iron had known her father. She was 8 when he died, old enough to understand what had been removed, old enough to feel the specific shape of what was gone. Eve had been 18 months old. No image to lose. She received a mother who was already narrowed, already given over entirely to the work, without having any memory of what came before. For Eve, there was no before. There was only this version of Marie, the woman who was brilliant and devoted and frequently absent, grieving a person her younger daughter had never met. They received the same woman. They received entirely different things from her. Marie Curie was 8 when her father died. Old enough to understand exactly what she had lost. Old enough to watch her mother disappear into the laboratory afterward and understand, in the way children understand things they cannot yet articulate, that the laboratory was where her mother had gone to survive. She followed. Not in grief. Not to stay close. She followed because she was genuinely built for it, ferociously curious, constitutionally precise, with a mind that moved the way her mother's moved. But the timing mattered. The following was also a reaching. The only way to be near Marie Curie, after 1906, was to enter the world where Marie Curie actually lived. By 17, Iron was operating mobile X-ray units at the Western Front alongside Marie, working in field hospitals that sat within range of enemy fire, threading X-ray plates beneath soldiers with shrapnel wounds while artillery fired in the middle distance. She did not flinch. Observers noted this. She was Marie's daughter in this too, the refusal to show emotion in the presence of difficulty, the insistence on the work regardless of what the work required. By 20, she was at the Radium Institute, the research center her parents had built. By 27, she was writing her doctoral dissertation on the alpha radiation of polonium, her parents' element, named after her mother's lost country, now the subject of the next generation's hands. What Iron received from her mother was not warmth, not the unconditional available presence that children are said to need. What she received was something harder to hold, a model of love expressed entirely through shared rigor. In her family, you demonstrated devotion by doing work that mattered. You showed up for the difficult question, not for the difficult feeling. She internalized this so completely that those who met her as an adult found her cold, brusque, abrupt, forgetting to say hello in the corridor. Frédéric Joliot, who came to work in the Radium Institute in 1924 and eventually became her husband, initially described her precisely this way: someone who created no warmth around her in the laboratory. But he kept watching, and what he came to understand, as he later wrote, was that beneath the exterior lived someone of extraordinary interior richness, deeply sensitive, poetic, capable of profound loyalty, who had simply been shaped, very early, not to perform any of it. They married in 1926. They both changed their names to Joliot-Curie. They published their research jointly as Marie and Pierre had published theirs. When they stood to receive the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1935, for the discovery of artificial radioactivity, the synthesis of new radioactive elements from stable ones, it was the second time a husband and wife had jointly won the prize. The first time had been Pierre and Marie, in 1903. Marie had died the year before, in July 1934. She knew the discovery had been made, in her final months, from a hospital bed. She told a visitor she believed iron and Frédéric's work would be recognized. She was right. She did not live to see it. Iron became the director of the Radium Institute, the institute Marie had built, now in the hands of the woman who had grown up inside it. She held political office as one of the first 3 women to serve in a French government cabinet. She fought for women's rights in science, for women's suffrage, for the peaceful use of nuclear energy. She raised 2 children, both became scientists. She was, in almost every documented dimension, the continuation of the woman who made her, and what she had inherited from her mother, invisibly, without consent, without anyone's knowledge, was already inside her. The clothing Marie had worn in the laboratory was radioactive. The research notes, the books, the personal papers, the hands that had touched Iron's hair, the house and so, where Marie had continued the work after Pierre's death, had been a laboratory of a kind, and the daughters had lived inside it. The body is a patient record keeper. Eve Curie did not become a scientist. The press treated this as charming. The one Curie who escaped. What is less discussed is what it actually cost her to be the one who could not find a place in the frame. She never knew her father. She was 18 months old. She received a mother who was already a widow, already narrowed, already feeding the work before the household. She also received a sister who had resolved the problem of their mother's absence by following her into it, who had found the one door that remained open and walked through it, leaving Eve standing at a house with no other entrance. Eve chose the opposite direction. She studied piano. She attended parties. She wore elegant clothes and high heels in a household where Marie wore the same plain black dress for years. She shone in rooms that would have made her mother visibly uncomfortable, and she knew it, and she was not apologizing. The American press dubbed her, in 1921, the girl with radium eyes. She was 17. She was vivid in a way that was entirely unlike anyone else in her family, and there is something in the phrase, radium eyes, that lands differently if you know what radium eventually did to the people who loved it. But she also stayed. When Iron married Frédéric in 1926, it was Eve who remained in the Paris apartment with Marie. She accompanied her mother to Belgium, Italy, Switzerland. At public ceremonies, she managed the crowd. Marie, by this point, found large gatherings overwhelming, the noise and the hands and the expectation. Eve navigated those rooms for her. She was her mother's social interpreter, the person who translated between Marie's interior world and the exterior one that kept insisting on her presence. She was, in a precise way, doing for her mother what her mother had never been able to do for her. Eve later said she had suffered, as a child, from a lack of sufficient attention. She said it plainly, without theater. She had suffered from it. The relationship deepened later, in her teens. The bond became genuine, sustaining, real. But the architecture of a childhood is not rebuilt in adolescence. What was absent in those early years left its specific shape. A person who did not receive enough attention in childhood does not, when attention finally arrives, feel whole. She feels the dimensions of the gap more precisely than before. What Eve inherited was the particular wound of the child who could not be what the parent unconsciously required. Not the scientific heir, not the continuation. She was the one who loved her mother without being able to serve the thing her mother loved most. After Marie died, Eve did something no one else in the Curie family had done. She wrote the book. Madame Curie, published in 1937, translated into 35 languages, winner of the American National Book Award, adapted by Hollywood in 1943 with Greer Garson in the title role. It was a biography of her mother written by the daughter who had felt undertended to as a child, and who then spent 3 years alone in a small apartment in Auteuil, sorting correspondence, traveling to Poland to find her mother's girlhood, gathering testimony from people who had known Marie before Paris, before Pierre, before the prizes. She was searching for the version of her mother that might have been available. Scholars have noted that the biography was specifically a defense, a rescue operation for a reputation that had been battered by scandal and institutional misogyny. It portrayed Marie as heroic, humble, almost impossibly pure. It left out the turbulent emotional interior. It constructed a legend rather than a woman. But the legend was also the most sustained act of love available to her. The version of love that remains when proximity wasn't possible, making the person visible, permanent, undeniable. Keeping them in the way you know how to keep things. I want to pause here because there's something in this pattern that I've been sitting with since I started tracing it. One daughter followed her mother into the laboratory and eventually into the same disease. The other moved as far from the laboratory as she could go, into music, into writing, into the elegant social world her mother found incomprehensible, and then, after her mother died, came back. Not to the science, to the story. What they both inherited was the impossibility of ordinary distance from this woman. Marie Curie was not someone you could be neutral about if she was your mother. You either became her continuation or you became her defender. Iron continued her. Eve preserved her. And I keep thinking, what would it have cost either of them to simply walk away, to be someone else entirely? And whether they ever knew that was an option. There were two inheritances in this family. One emotional, one physical. The physical one was quieter, and it took longer. Marie Curie's laboratory notes, the actual notebooks she used to record her experiments with polonium and radium, are today kept in lead-lined boxes in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Researchers who wish to read them must sign a liability waiver and handle them with protective equipment. The notebooks are still radioactive. They will be radioactive for another 1,500 years. The same is true of her personal papers. The same is true of the furniture from her laboratory. The same, in many ways, was true of the house and so where her daughters grew up. No one knew this in 1906. No one knew it in 1914, or even in 1924. The first formal standards for limiting radiation exposure in workers didn't appear until 1921. Marie had been carrying radioactive material in her coat pockets since 1898. She stored active samples in her desk drawer. She noted the faint blue glow they emitted in the dark and called it beautiful. She worked with unshielded hands for decades, and so did everyone around her, because the field was so new that what was happening to human tissue had not yet been named as something that could happen to human tissue. The danger was entirely invisible, and it had been living in the Curie home for years before anyone had language for it. Iron's exposure began in infancy. Her parents' clothing, the research notes on the kitchen table, the air in rooms where polonium had been handled. She received an accumulated dose across her entire childhood before she ever set foot in the laboratory professionally. And then she did set foot in the laboratory, at 17, on the Western Front, operating X-ray equipment with inadequate shielding. Then at the Radium Institute for decades. Then, in 1946, when a sealed capsule of polonium on her bench exploded. She inhaled it. The leukemia came slowly. Fatigue first. Then infection. Then the progressive failure of the bone marrow to do what bone marrow does. In her final year, she told a friend, breathing, eating, all the most elementary functions are becoming painful. She continued working. She drew up plans for new physics laboratories at Orsay. She attended peace conferences. She submitted papers. She kept going until the day her body made going impossible, in the same way her mother had kept going in the Alps sanatorium with hands that could no longer close properly, still asking about the research she could no longer reach. Iron Joliot-Curie died on March 17, 1956. Acute leukemia. She was 58 years old. She died in the Curie Hospital in Paris, named for the family whose work had made radiological medicine possible. The hospital where people came to be healed by the science the Curies had built. Frédéric Joliot-Curie died 2 years later. Liver disease attributed to radiation. He was 58. Eve, who had stepped away from the laboratory, who had gone toward pianos and dinner parties and literature, lived to 102. The record does not require commentary, but it does require reading. Marie Curie understood two different things about the damage she was passing down, and they exist in entirely separate categories. She did not know about the radiation. This is not a qualification offered in her defense. It is simply true. The science that would have told her what polonium did to bone marrow at low doses over long exposure did not yet exist. She remarked on the glow in her desk drawer because it was a phenomenon worth remarking on. The beautiful thing she had discovered was killing her, and she had no instrument that could measure this, and neither did anyone else. You cannot grieve what you cannot see. But she knew something else. She knew the work was consuming her in ways that her daughters could feel. She recorded it. In the diaries she kept writing to Pierre, year after year, in a one-sided correspondence that was itself a form of not being fully present to the living. She documented the particular guilt of the evenings she stayed at the bench. She wrote about iron's growing seriousness and what she thought it reflected. She wrote about Eve's brightness and the ways she worried she was not doing enough to meet it. She wrote about summer afternoons missed. She named the gap between what she felt for her daughters and what she was managing to give them, not in accusatory language but with the precision of a scientist who will not falsify a reading even when the reading is uncomfortable. Then she closed the diary and went back. Every morning. For 28 years. This is not condemnation. She provided. She arranged the cooperative school, the tutors, the summers, the music lessons, the Polish language so her daughters would know where they came from. She built a life for them that many women of her era would have considered extraordinary maternal devotion. And her nature, the one that had been formed by her mother's death at 10 and her sister's death the same year, and a decade of occupation and the deferred years and Pierre, that nature could only give what it had. Every loss had reduced the capacity for the unearned, unstudied presence. What remained was the work, and from the work she gave what she could, which was considerable. What she could not provide was the thing that cannot be arranged. The spontaneous availability. The interrupted evening. The mother who stayed because she felt like staying, not because the schedule permitted it. In July 1934, in the sanatorium at Passy, the bone marrow finally stopped. She could no longer hold a pen, could no longer sit upright without help. Those present said she remained oriented in her final days. She recognized faces. She could speak. Her mind was still there. Her body had simply processed itself past recovery. She died on July 4, 1934. She left one daughter who had become her continuation, and one daughter who had become her archivist. The difference between those two fates was a distance of 7 years, and the fact that one of them had lived in the laboratory and one of them had not. Eve spoke about her mother in 2 registers. As the author of the biography, she wrote with reverence. She constructed a Marie Curie of almost mythic purity, heroic and humble and incorruptible. Scholars would later note that this version of Marie left out the emotional turbulence, the scandal, the complicated interior. It presented what a daughter could bear to present. But in her own testimony about her childhood, Eve used different language. She said she had suffered, as a child, from a lack of sufficient attention. She said it without bitterness, with the matter-of-fact quality of someone who has lived long enough with the truth that she no longer needs it to be anything other than what it is. She also said this, in her own words, about what her mother had given her and iron. Several things, nevertheless, were permanently imprinted upon us: the taste for work, a certain indifference toward money, and an instinct of independence which convinced us both that in any combination of circumstances we should know how to get along without help. She said, we were taught to get along without help. She said it as tribute. She may also have said it as the most precise available description of what it produced in a child: not bitterness, not resentment, but a very thorough training in self-sufficiency, in the expectation that need would not be met by asking, that the only reliable thing was your own capacity to continue. And Eve continued. She spent 40 years traveling to more than 100 countries with her husband, who ran UNICEF from 1965 to 1979, visiting children in poverty, in conflict zones, in places where they were invisible to every institution that should have seen them. She advocated for them. She went where they were. She gave what was needed. The daughter who said she had suffered from insufficient attention spent the last 4 decades of her life making sure children who were being failed could be seen. She did not call it that. Iron left almost no testimony about her mother as a mother. What she said, in interviews and in her own scientific writing, was about her mother as a physicist. The precision, the integrity, the refusal to allow external pressure to alter a result. She spoke about Marie the way a student speaks about a formative teacher, with reverence that has been slightly formalized by time, stripped of the personal, offered in the clean language of professional admiration. She said, for my part, I consider science to be the paramount interest of my life. Whether she understood this as independent vocation or as the inherited grammar of a household where love was expressed through work and presence was demonstrated by showing up at the bench, that distinction does not appear in the record. Perhaps it had never existed as a distinction for her. What is documented is that in 1956, dying in the Curie hospital, Joliot-Curie continued working until she could not. She planned laboratories from a hospital bed. She drafted proposals. She attended meetings as long as her body permitted her to attend meetings. She did not stop because stopping was not a category she had been given. James Chadwick, who had raced against the Joliot-Curies in the early 30s for the neutron discovery, wrote her obituary in Nature. He wrote, she knew her mind and spoke it, sometimes perhaps with devastating frankness, but her remarks were informed with such regard for scientific truth and with such conspicuous sincerity that they commanded the greatest respect in all circumstances. She knew her mind and spoke it. Her mother's daughter, to the last hour. The wound in this family was not one thing. It was compound, and its parts operated on different timescales. There was the grief of April 1906, which took a woman capable of 2 kinds of love of a person and love of an idea, and collapsed it, irrevocably, into one. There was the work that became the structure of survival, and in becoming that, became a wall. There was the narrowing that her daughters felt as absence, not because she withheld love but because the love had been routed entirely through the laboratory, and one of them could follow it there and one of them could not. And there was the invisible thing, the particles in the clothing, the glow in the desk drawer, the air in the rooms of the house and so, that did not announce itself, that the science of the era could not yet see, that waited. Iron followed the work and the radiation and died at 58, in her mother's hospital, of her mother's disease. Her children, Helene Langevin Joliot and Pierre Joliot, both became scientists. The pattern did not stop with iron. It passed, intact, into a 3rd generation. Eve carried the distance and the elegance and the determination to be seen for something that was entirely her own. She lived to 102. She spent her final decades giving to children what she had, by her own account, not fully received. She also went back to Poland in 1935 to search for her mother's childhood, She traveled alone. She gathered documents. She interviewed people who had known Marie Skłodowska before she was Marie Curie. She was looking, though she may not have named it this way, for the woman in the Warsaw photograph. The 23-year-old withheld back force and a belief that the world was about to make good on a long promise. The mother her daughters might have had if the promise had not cost Pierre's life to keep. Whether she found her in the Polish letters and the remembrances of old neighbors, Eve did not say publicly. She wrote the biography. She defended the legend. She published it in 6 countries simultaneously. She spent the next 60 years of her life, 60 years, ensuring that the name and the work and the achievement were not lost, not obscured by the men who had tried to keep her mother out of the academy, not flattened by the myth of the humble scientist who worked only for humanity and never for herself. She made her mother permanent. And at the very end of Madame Curie, in the book's closing pages, after all the Nobel Prizes and the laboratories and the wars and the losses, Eve wrote this: I hope that the reader may constantly feel, across the ephemeral movement of one existence, what in Marie Curie was even more rare than her work or her life: the immovable structure of a character, the stubborn effort of an intelligence, the free immolation of a being that could give all and take nothing, could even receive nothing, and above all the quality of a soul in which neither fame nor adversity could change the exceptional purity. A being that could give all and take nothing. A being that could not receive. Eve Curie was 29 when her mother died. She spent 3 years after that writing the sentence above, about a woman who, by her own childhood testimony, had not given her sufficient attention. And what she wrote was not reckoning. Not the grief of an undertended child finally given space to say so. Not anger dressed as biography. She wrote a hymn. That is where the wound rests. Not only in the leukemia, though the leukemia is there. Not only in the radioactive notebooks in their lead containers in Paris, though they are still there, still emitting, still requiring protective gloves to touch, as they will for another 15 centuries. Not in the particle accelerators that carry the family name, or the hospital, or the crater on Venus named for iron. It rests in the biography, in the daughter who could not be seen by her mother, who spent 3 years making her mother the most seen woman in the world. A being that could give all and take nothing, could even receive nothing. Eve wrote that sentence. She was the only one in the family who could have written it. The last word belongs to Eve. Iron Joliot-Curie died March 17, 1956, at the Curie Hospital, Paris. Leukemia. Age 58. Eve Curie Labouisse died October 22, 2007, New York City. Age 102. Marie Curie's notebooks are stored in lead-lined boxes in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Researchers must sign a liability waiver before handling them. The books still glow in the dark. They always did.